Hello, welcome to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today is September 15th, 2023, and there's a lot to talk about, and I really want to get right into it. So let's do it. Are you ready? Let's go. So the first thing I want to say is that, you can find all my show notes at vanceginn.substack.com. Or my website, vanceginn.com. You can also find a lot of my posts on x.com, formerly known as Twitter. And so you can find a lot of those on there. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well under Let People Prosper. So be sure to check those out as well. So that way you have all the information you need. And I share a lot more on X actually throughout the day on new things that are coming out. So that's another good way to follow what's happening each and every day. All right. So on the previous LPP episode that was out this week was with Dr. Brian Blaze of Paragon Health Institute on healthcare policy. We dove into it deeply about Medicare, Medicaid, how it's influencing the overall economy, and what we could do about it to really have a more affordable, timely access to quality care. That's really should be what it should be about, and really looking at outcomes versus just the number of dollars that are going into the system. That's not what it should be about. So be sure to check that one out if you missed it. And the upcoming Let People Prosper episode is going to be with my good friend Dory Wiley of Commerce Street Holdings on financial markets, what's happening out there, and what you should be looking at, and what the policy should be by the Federal Reserve and Congress to really allow for us to have as much prosperity as possible, financially, materially, spiritually, intellectually, and everything else. So don't miss that one coming out on Monday. And then on Wednesday, there's going to be a bonus episode with This Week in Bitcoin. Adam Meister is the one who runs that. And so we talk a lot about the economy, the weaknesses in the economy, sound currency, cryptocurrency, and everything else. So that's coming out on Wednesday. So don't miss that one as well. So let's get right into it now with what's happening across the economy, starting off with the national issues. There were a lot of key reports that came out this week, so I want to go through this somewhat quickly, but don't miss the post that I'll put in the show notes page, where I'll have some charts and everything else that you can get all the information you need, along with links to where all this information comes from. So the key things that come out with this income and poverty reports, along with healthcare coverage, are those key things, right? So one of those being household income, where real, which just means inflation adjusted household income, was down again last year in 2022. So it's always a year, behind by 2.3% to 74,580 that year. Now, this is the lowest real household income since 2018. We reached a peak, the historic high, record high in 2019, which was after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, after the deregulation of the Trump administration. Look, I have my beef with some of the stuff that was going on in the Trump administration with too much government spending, or not vetoing some of the budgets that were out there, as the budgets by Trump that would put out were actually pretty good. I helped write one of those, the last one. But the actual passage by Congress of the budget, they have the power of the purse, was not restrained, and there was too much government spending, and also the tariffs, right? Those were drags on economic growth, whereas the tax cuts and the deregulation were helping support a lot of that growth that was out there. And so that's why you also see broad-based gains in inflation-adjusted dollars across the income spectrum. In fact, you saw a declining income inequality because of the faster rate of pace of the growth of the lower income households compared to the upper income households during those Trump years. And that was really by growing the pie. And now what we see is an administration, the Biden administration and Congress, wanting to redistribute the pie. The more that you redistribute the pie, the pie tends to shrink, right? Because you're cutting up in different sizes. You're not really focused on growth and growing the production possibilities frontier. If you think about it that way, you're not growing the economy. So if you're starting to cut it all up, you're actually reducing or the incentive to grow the economy. And so we have is you have less economic opportunity. And in fact, when you look at these latest numbers from real household income, you'll see in average weekly earnings and things of that nature, lower income people are growing at a faster clip, but upper income people, middle income people, in particular average households, theirs are actually going down as well. And so that is a decrease in income inequality, but in the wrong way, where you're redistributing income because everyone is not benefiting in the process. I think what you see with capitalism, and we've seen over time, is that everybody tends to benefit and prosper together. And that this isn't what happens whenever you have a top-down centralized planning sort of system like we've had under the Biden administration and everything else. This is just not a good situation. And so those are some key areas to look for moving forward. Also, you have so when we look at household income, you also can take a look at what's going on. And for the year, like I said, it was down 2.3%. So that's 74,580. Just real quick on that. When you look across races, all of them were basically flat or declining, except for blacks. Theirs did increase in 2022 to a record high, but the others have all been either flat or really declining since 2018, since 2019 when there was that peak. So that's good situation for blacks, but not for others. And so this is something that we also want to follow up with. The other key thing, though, that comes out in this big report is what's going on with poverty. So there are different measures of poverty. There's the official poverty measure, which looks at pre-tax income and some other things that are out there, but it doesn't look at geographic differences in the economy. Whenever you look at healthcare costs and everything else, it also looks at 3 times the cost of a minimum food diet in 1963. That's the poverty threshold. It varies by family size, composition, and age of household, and it uses the consumer price index for all urban consumers in their differentiation over time or adjustments for inflationary pressures. There's also what's called the supplemental poverty measure, though, that was created, I think, in 2010 by some folks in the Biden administration. And it looks more like the resource units. It's based on recent expenditures for food, clothing, shelters, utility, telephone, and internet. It varies by family size, its composition, and housing tenure with geographic adjustments for differences in housing costs. That's a big part, is it actually adjusts for the housing costs. So California is going to have a higher housing cost than places like Texas or Louisiana and others. I think that's important. It also, and so with, like I said, the official poverty measure is just gross pre-tax cash income. Supplemental poverty measure uses cash income plus non-cash benefits. It includes welfare payments, work expenses, medical expenses, and child support paid to another household. So it's a much broader form of the amount of income that's there, and it's looking at a different measure of the inequality. And so when we look at these things, what you will notice is that the overall official poverty measure stayed about flat overall, still about 11.5% across the United States. When you look at the supplemental poverty measure, it increased a little bit to 9.8%. And so this is a 3-year average from 2020 to 2022 to weed out some of the volatility that happens, smooth out some of the volatility that happens from year over year. And so that's something to look at. When you look at the supplemental poverty measure and how much it increased by, it was up by 4.6 percentage points from 21 to 22. That was the first increase since 2010 when this number was first reported that it's actually seen an increase. You also saw a large increase in the supplemental poverty rate for children, those under 18. And now a lot of that was because of the expiring pandemic related safety net programs that were out there. Medicaid, you have food stamps, you have TANF and some other things that weren't related to work requirements, that they were waived during the pandemic health emergency and public emergency. And so what that does is that made it to where many people were getting benefits that otherwise wouldn't. And now when the eligibility criteria are changing, they're not getting that anymore. And so that's showing that people are in poverty. But the problem with that measure is, right, the supplemental poverty measure is it's including all these transfer payments that seems like, okay, we're getting people or getting children out of poverty and everything else. But it's not based on actual income that's growing the economy. It's based on redistribution of income that can come at a very high cost. A big part of that was the child tax credit, which would increase dramatically. But if that had been extended over a decade, would cost about $1.2 trillion, meaning more money to the debt and deficit, higher interest rates, higher inflation, and more cost to the overall economy. And so this was an important part to say, no, we need to get back to where we were before. And in fact, what I would like to see is for us to eliminate the child tax credit, other things, earned income tax credit, and allow for us to have lower tax rates for everyone. So that way, if you want to have kids and more kids, then you have more money. If you're not able to have kids, then you have more money as well. But we're taking more money out of the out of government, taking it from us, right? And we're having more money in the productive private sector, and that allows for more growth, which all goes back to limiting government spending. So I know there's a lot of noise about the child poverty rate went up under the supplemental poverty measure, but just remember that was because of a lot of redistribution that was slowing the economy and creating worse problems in the process of a lower real household income, you paying more for your overall bills. And so we've got to make sure we look at everything and not just what's at the surface. And so I think that was an important part to get back to normal with a lot of these poverty programs. So when you look at the states, an overview of the 3-year average from 2021 or 2020 to 2022, the highest for the official poverty measure was in Nevada of 18.2%, Mississippi was second at 17.8%. Louisiana, 16.9%. So a lot of work needed there. Texas, so some other big states. Texas was 13.7, Florida 13.1, New York 12.4, and California 11.4. The lowest poverty rates were in Minnesota at 7.7, Utah 7.1, and Maine 7.1. So that was for the official poverty measure. But when you look at the supplemental poverty measure, which has these geographic differences in housing cost, right? So where it's more expensive, probably have more people in poverty. That's exactly what we see. California was at 13.2%, the highest in the nation. Florida was second at 12.7%. Mississippi third, 12.5%. You also had New York 11.9, Texas 11.3, Louisiana 10.9. And then when you look at the lowest supplemental poverty rates, you have Maine at the lowest, 4.6%, Wisconsin 5.1%, and Minnesota at 5.5%. So that kind of gives you an overview about what's happening in the different states. Some of these did show improvements. And so I think, they showed a higher poverty rate, just like you did for supplemental poverty rate for the nation. And so that's indicative of the higher costs, right? And housing costs are going through the roof, but also, the incomes aren't keeping pace with what's happening with inflation. And so this is another key indication there. So that's something to really look at when you're looking at overall. And the other big thing was that healthcare coverage, really was down some. And so there's a lot of talk about that. But we got to remember the health coverage, whether it's Medicaid or Obamacare or something else, that doesn't equal timely access to quality care, like what we really want to see. And so coverage is not the best indicator for us to look at. Even if you nationalized healthcare across the economy, you still would have a lot of people have rationing. They couldn't get care like they otherwise would. And so if there's not proper pricing mechanisms in place because of basically a centralized system like we already have mostly in healthcare, only about 5% are actual cash payments, which is where you would actually have a free market in healthcare. That means 95% is directed by someone else and not by you and the doctors. So that's something to look at there. Also this week, though, we had the BLS report on consumer price index shows inflation was elevated and is continuing to increase. It's up to 3.7%. Remember, it got down to a low of 3% just a couple months ago. Then it's increased the last two months. And so we're starting to see that rise again, which is what I've been talking about, is that we've got to keep our focus on inflationary pressures that are out there. And the Federal Reserve needs to cut its balance sheet more substantially. It's down a little over 8% from its peak. Remember, it was at $9 trillion. Now it's down to closer to $8.1 trillion, but it's still more than double the $4 trillion that it was before the pandemic. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done with the Fed's balance sheet. They're probably going to pause this month in raising their federal funds interest rate target at the 5.5%. But my guess is that they'll have to raise it again in the future, maybe even have it closer to 6% by the end of the year, which is what I've said recently in a new commentary at econlib.com, where it's why the August jobs report adds up to a weak economy. And so whenever you look at that overall report or commentary, I really talk a lot about what's happening there and what's going on in the economy and some of the changes that need to be made. But really, this is the fault of Congress overspending, Biden over regulating, and Fed over printing. And this is the result. And when you look at just since Biden became president in January of 2021, gasoline prices are up 50%. Food is up 20%. When you look at overall inflation, it's up, I think right around, I think it's around 17%. Even core prices are up 14, 15%. But wages, average hourly wages are only up 11%. So that tells you why people feel like this is a not a good economy, even with the low unemployment rate and everything else. And I think that's something we really need to watch is people's wages aren't keeping up with this inflationary pressure. And I think some of these inflationary pressures are going to keep going up, really. If you look at oil prices, we talked about the production cuts by Saudi Arabia and Russia, what that means to China and other places. But oil prices have went up this week over $90 a barrel for the West Texas Intermediate and closer to $95 a barrel for the Brent crude that's priced across the globe. Both of those are world oil prices. And this is the first time that the West Texas Intermediate has been above $90 since November of 2022. So almost a year ago. So I think we'll expect to see higher gasoline prices. I know they've been going up around me, probably around you as well. So that's also going to put more inflationary pressures out there. And there's a lot of talk out there about in the media and some talking heads about, the Fed needs to pause. They raise interest rates too much. But remember, I think that we're looking at the wrong metric. We don't need to just look at the interest rate. That is an indicator, but we need to look at the Fed's balance sheet, and it's just still too large. And so when we're looking at these things, let's make sure we're looking at the right things. And yes, This is going to put pressure on mortgage rates and everything else, as we're seeing that closer to 7.5%. But at the same time, interest rates were too low for too long, just like what happened in the 2000s. And so we've seen that again to this huge rise up in housing prices. And then those booms eventually bust. And so that's what, unfortunately, we're going to see before the market can really heal. I would like that to be the case. I would like for them to cut government spending and start to reduce the pressure from government, right? But I don't see that they're going to do that right away. And so we're going to see the pain happen across the economy and through different markets pretty quickly. So just something to check out. And I'll keep talking about that as well. On the state side, there was more tax relief expected in 3 of 25 states that have already passed income tax reduction of the last 3 years. Those being Arkansas, Wyoming, and North Carolina. They're looking to have special sessions to pass some more income tax relief. It was a good op-ed in Forbes by Patrick Gleason at Americans for Tax Reform, where he really goes in a lot of those details. But I'm hopeful that that will continue, not only in those states, but in other states as well, Louisiana, Texas, and others. They really need to be focused on making sure they're cutting their taxes, going to a flat income tax, and ultimately eliminating property taxes too, but income taxes. That way you can keep all of your hard-earned income and then decide how it's seen fit. You should also be able to keep all your property without the threat of it being taken away from you for property taxes. But, a lot of states aren't able to work down that path just yet, like some are in Texas, including myself. So the last thing I want to talk about is that the Department of Justice has started its antitrust trial with Google over their supposed violation for its search engine. Basically, they're arguing that they have too much market power, that they're a monopoly and everything else. But my take is it's really just a sham trial. That's violation of capitalism and consumers, as competition is what we want. And there is a lot of competition in the search engines market. When you think about Bing, DuckDuckGo, a number of others that you could probably mention more than me. And so there is competition in the market. It's just that consumers like Google. It's their first place they want to check out. They know that they can rely on it and everything else. And so if there's demand by consumers in the marketplace without government regulations and barriers and everything else, then there's nothing wrong with that. I don't really call it a monopoly. In fact, I don't think that there's a monopolies in the private sector as long as there's competition that's going on. It's when the government gets involved, like they try to do with antitrust policy, and try to force a top-down approach within the marketplace decided by consumers. Remember the knowledge problem by Hayek? These are the sort of things that you're going to get into. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has just been radical whenever it comes to antitrust, whether it be Lena Khan over at the Federal Trade Commission or Cantor at the Department of Justice. This is something that we've really got to keep an eye on, because it really will break down capitalism and it'll reduce our choices as consumers and where to work in the future. So we've got a lot to talk about. Thank you for joining me today on This Week's Economy. Until next time, let people prosper.